So let me go ahead and welcome you all here. We're really excited tonight to have you. Tonight is a collaboration between our center and the Center for Latin American Studies. So that's a very exciting thing for us to be doing here at Stanford. And we couldn't be more delighted to be here to welcome Ambassadors Carlo Pascual and Arturo Sarrocan to Stanford. The topics that we'll be discussing tonight on NAFTA and the future of US-Mexico relations couldn't be more timely. I think you'll agree with me. I'm going to introduce, as long as my voice holds up, so far so good, very quickly, and then I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Alberto Diaz-Cayeros, who's here with us. So let me first introduce to you Ambassador Carlos Pascual. He is a former senior United States diplomat. He served as ambassador to Mexico from 2009 to 2011 and was most recently the State Department's top energy official. As ambassador, he worked to open negotiations on the management of oil and gas reserves spanning the two countries, to build a new border strategy to advance trade while also combating illicit flows, to strengthen cooperation around rule of law, and to advance the human and cultural connections between the people of Mexico and the United States generally. As a former US energy envoy and coordinator for the International Energy Affairs at the State Department, Ambassador Pascual also established and directed the Energy Resource Bureau as he served as senior advisor to the Secretary of State on energy issues. In that role, he led negotiations on Iranian oil sanctions with China, India, and other countries. He's now the senior vice president at IHS Markit, where he focuses on global energy issues and international affairs. Perhaps more importantly, he holds a bachelor's degree from our very own Stanford University, as well as a master's degree in public policy from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Something you might not know about Ambassador Pascual is that while he was an undergraduate here at Stanford, he was also elected chair of Stanford in Government. So turning to Ambassador Arturo Sarrocan, he is a former Mexican ambassador to the US from 2007 to 2013. So you might notice they have overlapping tenures here, which was part of the master scheme of inviting them both to Stanford at the same time. A career diplomat, he attained the rank of career ambassador in 2006. Ambassador Sarrocan served in the Mexican Foreign Ministry as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Inter-American Affairs, as Chief of Policy Planning, and as Consul General to New York City, among other positions. Arturo is now an international strategic consultant based in Washington. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and is a distinguished visiting scholar at the University of Southern California. We won't hold it against him. He holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from El Colegio de Mexico and a master's degree in U.S. foreign policy from the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, where he was both a Fulbright Scholar and a Ford Foundation Fellow. Something you might not know about Ambassador Sarrocan is that he is also the goalkeeper in a semi-pro soccer, or should I say football league in Montgomery County. I think a distinction he's perhaps as proud of as any of these others. Finally, we're very privileged to have Alberto Diaz-Cayeros as our moderator this evening. Professor Diaz-Cayeros is director of the Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford. He's also a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Affairs, where he's based at the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Professor Diaz-Cayeros is a political scientist whose work focuses on federalism, poverty, and economic reform in Latin America, and in Mexico in particular. He served on the faculty of Stanford, UCLA, and UC San Diego, where he was also director of the Center for US-Mexican Studies. He earned his PhD from Duke University. So with that, my voice made it. I'll get out of the way. Please join me in thanking all three of these to the stage for a conversation.
Me quieren a mí en esta, así es que, en fin, no sé por qué quieren que yo esté ahí. They want me here. No, I think you sit in the middle. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, everyone, for being here. It is really a pleasure for me to be sitting down with two people I really admire. I admire them as persons. I admire the roles each of them played as ambassadors for their own countries. But also, I admire the way they, during their tenure, I think it was a very high point of diplomacy and the relationship between Mexico and the United States. There's always frictions, there's always tensions in the relationship, but there's also friendship, there's always cooperation. And I think, this is, just an incredible opportunity to listen to them together in this forum. I'm gonna plunge directly into some of the questions that we have prepared for them. We want to make sure we leave enough time for you as an audience to also ask your own questions. And I will start a little bit before we get into NAFTA, talking first about the US-Mexico relation. So the one thing I was struck, and I didn't realize this until we had made the invitation to them, is that in some ways there has been a lot of conflict in Mexico and in the US on the diplomatic kind of capacity of putting ambassadors in place in both countries. In the case of Mexico, we had 4 ambassadors over a period of 6 years, which was very different from the tenure that Ambassador Sarukhan had. He was ambassador for a whole 6 years. In the case of the US, it took 11 months to confirm Roberta Jacobson, the current ambassador, and she's not going to stay. She's leaving. She's left, actually, or she's leaving.
May 5th. May 5th is
May 5th, exactly. And historically, the ambassadors' positions in Mexico have been very stable. The average tenure for both countries in the post-war period, all the way through NAFTA, 4 years, every 4 years, 15 ambassadors. So what does this mean? Is this telling us something about more volatility in the relationship? Why is it so difficult to keep in place ambassadors or put them in place? Could you share with us some insight about this?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's always a privilege and a pleasure to come out to beautiful Palo Alto and come to Stanford. Doubly so with a dear friend and colleague, Ambassador Carlos Pascual. You're talking about ambassadors, Alberto, and many people don't realize that an ambassador is usually effective or not, depending also on the relationship that he or she have with their counterparts in the other capital city. We sometimes play the role of good cop, bad cop. He sometimes marshaled our bureaucracies in Mexico. I sometimes marshaled his bureaucracies in the US, and we sometimes overlap. But that connectivity and that synergy is a very important piece of what makes a successful ambassador. So it's a great pleasure to be with you here. And I also want to recognize and acknowledge Secretary of State, former Secretary of State, George Shultz, who has played such an important role in rethinking the North American relationship via the North American Forum over these many years, at a very trying time, obviously, for the North American relationship, and in particular for the US-Mexico relationship. I don't know if this volatility in ambassadors says anything specific about the relationship itself. There are different reasons. In the US, increasingly, a process where the Senate has bogged down and slowed down the process of confirmation. Roberta Jacobson spent 8 months, 6 months waiting for Senate confirmation over a completely unrelated issue to Mexico-US relationships, which was Venezuela. In the case of Mexico, probably a president who isn't too invested in the US-Mexico relationship, who really doesn't understand it, who probably made a couple of bad decisions in those designations. But I don't think it necessarily says anything about the dynamics of the relationship per se. There hasn't been any case where an ambassador has been withdrawn or has been withheld or the agrément has been withheld because there's a specific issue that is blowing up the relationship. So it has more to do with the internal domestic dynamics of either side as a trigger for some of these delays and some of this very high rate and very high unusual turnover that we've had, at least on the Mexican side, where we've had 4 ambassadors in 8 months without an ambassador in the middle of the campaign, with Donald Trump hitting Mexico like a piñata. Mexico had no ambassador in Washington, D.C.
Well, let me echo the thanks to Grant Alberto for having us here. Secretary Schultz, always a pleasure to see you, and thank you for your chairmanship of the North American Forum, which really has been a critical factor in maintaining dialogue and stability in the relationship. And just building on what Arturo just said right now, we need that stability in the relationship right now, and it's going to become even more critical in the coming months, because my sense is it's going to become more complicated. Arturo set the world's record for Mexican ambassadors in Washington. He ran 6 years straight, was a great counterpart, and we did work very effectively together. I left after about 2 years because of events that in some ways had everything and nothing to do with Mexico, which were related to WikiLeaks. And when they came out and they indicated some of the traffic cables that we were writing about organized crime and how it had further spread in Mexico, President Calderon got very upset. And at a certain point, and it's probably one of the hardest things I've had to do professionally in my life, is to make that judgment. Wow, does it help if I'm still here, if I have become the target of the president of the country that I'm trying to reach out and build a relationship with? Because in a sense what happened is that he took those cables, which were confidential communications between the embassy in Mexico and Washington, trying to explain why at that point 10 to 11,000 people were dying in homicides every year, which seems like a low number now that we're up to 27,000. But that became taken by the president of Mexico as something which was directly an affront and questioning his authority. So one of the really hard things for me was actually making that choice of saying, you know, this doesn't help and it's better for me to go. And I think that that's one of the things that really you come back to in this issue of ambassadorial relationships. Because in the end, what you're trying to do is to build relationships in a country and to understand it in depth, understand the politics, the economics, the social life, the culture, what drives it and where it's going to go, and try to communicate that back to your own government so that you can find points of intersection and you can make those connections work in ways that are going to make things better for both countries. And I think that that's going to be one of the toughest challenges right now. At a point in time when there is as much tension as there is in the relationship between Mexico and the United States, can individuals play that role of building bridges, coming together, working with their counterparts as we did to in fact actually create a better environment that allows you to see that it's not just a zero-sum game, you can both win.
Can I follow up on this? Because it seems to me that one of the challenges for the relationship right now is also public opinion, the way in which there has been a very radical shift. I have some data, for example, from the Pew Research Center. This is last year, at the end of the year. Americans, their favorable view of Mexico dropped from 66 to 30%. So it was very high. It was, 66% just even after the election of Trump, but then it fell very quickly. 93% of Mexicans say they have no confidence that the US president will do the right thing in world affairs. That's kind of the wording of the question. But it used to be 50% during the Obama years, that exact same question. So there's a radical shift in public opinion in both countries. There was a time when I was studying in graduate school and in my, back in the day, that people talked, the titles of books related to Mexico were things like Limits to Friendship, Distant Neighbor. It was all this tone that there was this huge, impasse and distance between the two countries. How do you deal with this? Because these are the publics that are, in some ways, polarized and don't see the relationship the way they did the last 10, 20 years since NAFTA.
It's a bit of a complex story because trend lines are moving in very weird ways. For many, many, many years and decades, Mexico was sort of a jingoistic, inward-looking country as it came to the United States. Octavio Paz, one of Mexico's Nobel laureates, famously wrote an essay on the US-Mexico relationship around the early 1970s, and he said that Mexico and the US had a hard time getting along because Mexicans didn't know how to speak up and Americans didn't know how to listen. One of the things that NAFTA changed was that Mexicans had to start speaking up to be able to lobby and get NAFTA across the finish line, and Americans started tuning in and listening to a crucial trading partner south of the border. And one of the very important facets that allowed both Carlos and myself to do our work was that despite this history, despite this convoluted history, despite this real, true asymmetry of diplomatic power between the United States and Mexico, most of Mexican public opinion started moving. And either because they have a cousin, an uncle, a friend, someone in the United States, either legally or undocumented, who lives here, who sends monies, who sends remittances to Mexico, perceptions of the United States started changing dramatically in Mexico. In fact, it was weird to see that political elites were more suspicious of the relationship with the United States than were the man and woman on the street. What has happened, and I said this throughout the 2016 presidential campaign, where what won the day was storytelling and narrative, not hard data, that the biggest challenge that Trump was launching for the US-Mexico relationship was that it could threaten to wind back public perceptions across both sides of the border. And in Mexico, it has happened. This Pew Research Center survey that you quote, in a year, from December of 2016 to from January 2017 to January 2018, favorable perceptions of the United States and Mexico went from 66 to 31% in a year. It is the most precipitous drop of favorable perceptions of the United States in any country on the face of the earth. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out why that has happened. Curiously, in the US, you've seen a trend which is actually working in the other direction. In the last year, favorable perceptions of Mexico in the United States have inched up to 66, 67%. Why? My guess is that it's been a natural response to the chest-thumping, anti-Mexico tirades of Donald Trump, and the way a lot of editorial boards in the United States have come out and said, whoa, this is a uniquely important relationship with the United States. It has a profound bearing on the security, the well-being, and the prosperity of the United States. And many Americans get it too. Yes, there is a 32% that is still, chanting, build a wall, deport them all. But there's been a curious growth in the United States in understanding the dynamics of the relationship. Now, the problem is that with what happened last week, and for the first time, the Mexican president stepping up in a publicly televised address, rebuking President Trump, with all presidential candidates in Mexico responding to Donald Trump, with the announcement that came last night by the Mexican foreign minister saying that he has been instructed by the president to review all ongoing cooperation, bilateral cooperation mechanisms with the United States. Public opinion in Mexico is going to make it very hard, regardless of who wins the elections on July the 1st, to continue to make the case that we need a strategic, forward-leaning relationship with the United States. And for those of us who've dedicated, I'm one of those, Secretary knows this, most foreign ministries or the Department of State like to have generalists, people that you can send from Portugal to Cyprus, Portugal to Mozambique to Paraguay. I spent my whole 20 plus years in the Mexican foreign ministry as a US hand, which means that I've dedicated all my diplomatic career to the US. For those of us who've dedicated our careers to trying to build upon a truly strategic relationship between these two countries, this is a very, very challenging moment because public opinion in Mexico, which today 75% of all Mexicans being polled before this incident last week said that the Mexican government was doing a bad job confronting and dealing with Trump and the US relationship. This is going to put constraints on the appetite, willingness, bandwidth of any Mexican president from whichever party wins on July the 1st to invest significant political and diplomatic capital in the relationship with the United States, at least for the next 2 years. I hope it's just 2 more years.
So, so one of the things that President Trump succeeded in doing was actually building unanimous support in Mexico behind the president in Mexico, which was seemingly an impossible thing up until a couple of days ago. And just to give you a sense of it, I mean, in the polls right now, which party would you not vote for? 47% say the president's party. And there has been an antipathy toward the president, toward corruption, that has really undermined the unity of politics internally within Mexico. Right? Mm-hmm. So in that context, the president of Mexico has actually come forward and made the statement saying that I am standing up for the rights of Mexican citizens, and we are going to do what's right for Mexico and for Mexicans, and all of the political candidates are behind that. The striking thing was that suddenly on this issue, if there's unity on any issue in Mexico's politics, it's that the Mexican people need to support the dignity of their own country. Mm-hmm. Right. So the question becomes then, where does that take us on the politics between the two? And here I think we have to step back for a little bit and understand the dynamics of what's happening in the relationship between the two countries. So there are 3 big issues that keep influencing the direction of US-Mexico politics. One is on trade and commerce, and the roots of it go back to NAFTA. But increasingly that has been put on stealing jobs from somebody, from American workers. And let's come back to this question in a minute. There are issues related to immigration and the border. And increasingly, they have been put in terms of not just security, but an affront that was created by the implication of putting the National Guard on the border and having a wall. And then the third issue is related to security and drugs. And usually those are 3 questions that are handled separately. But increasingly what's happened is they get intertwined, and they get more intertwined on the part of the United States, because if you upset me on the issues of NAFTA, I'm going to come back and threaten with something which might be border guards, which might be the creation of the wall. And it's created a sense that these issues are used to play back into a base of American politics. And so the perception is that in the United States now, these questions have not just become issues of substance that are debated on the merits of what's good for the United States and what's good for Mexico and what advances the interests of each, but how do they play out politically, and when do they become convenient arguments? And when the United States put those arguments in the context of rapists and criminals, that became very personal for Mexico. And so it's not surprising, in a sense, that on the one hand, the attitudes in Mexico have sunk so deeply because the arguments have been very personal. These are not just technical arguments about trade and border security. Mm-hmm. These are arguments about the character of a nation, right? And the reason that the president of Mexico is able to turn that and actually create it as a basis of support on these questions of the US-Mexico relationship is that he's standing up for dignity. But the insecurity that lies behind it is that these questions of trade, border, security have become rooted in a populist base. And that gives them a certain instability and unpredictability that makes it even harder to come out with more constructive outcomes. I think that that's part of the reality that we're playing into right now.
Can I ask about NAFTA very directly now, since we are plunging into the question of the relationship. So before I ask you how NAFTA could be better, could I ask you a very direct question? Can you see a world, is there a world where there is no NAFTA? And what does that world look like? I mean, in each of the countries, what happens if some kind of catastrophic breakdown in negotiations and nobody can agree on anything?
you want to go?
Go.
All right.
I'll follow you.
Okay. Look, there's certainly a possibility that there could be no NAFTA in the future. And when you think about how big it was, the trade between Mexico and the United States at the point that NAFTA was negotiated was, you probably remember this exactly, I think it was like $60 billion a year. And now it's increased to, where are we now?
Not North American?
Yeah.
It's 1.3 trillion.
1.3 trillion.
Intra-North
and
American
between the United
trade
States
flows per year.
and Mexico, it's what, about 600?
It's about 650, yeah.
650 billion. So it just gives you a sense of
One,
how much.
1.3 billion per day.
So it gives you a sense of how much it's increased over that period of time. So one of the things that really struck me when I was U.S. ambassador in Mexico was that American companies would consistently come to me and say, until we actually put NAFTA in place, we stopped being competitive in our exports. Our exports in vehicles, in farm equipment. Caterpillar told me at one point that they had not been able to break into the Asian markets for 10 years until they had an integration of supply chains that allowed them to reduce their costs. And one of the figures that gets cited around a lot, this hasn't been documented in a while, but the figures from most of the work that's been done, we think is around the same element. Of finished products that are exported from Mexico to the United States, about 40% of the content is from the United States, right? So the thing that I just want to plant in your minds is that this trade between the United States and Mexico is not just an issue, it's not just a story of trade deficits, it's also a story of increasing American competitiveness. Now, can the United States walk away from that? I think part of the issue is the way that NAFTA has been spun as stealing jobs from Americans. But let's just talk about the timeline for a second. So there are negotiations that are continuing right now. There are going to be high-level ministerial meetings that take place this week. President Trump at one point had suggested maybe this could be completed by the Summit of the Americas later in the week. Now it's suggested that that could go on later. The Mexican Minister of Economy said, don't see this happening or closing before the first week of May. But even if you do that, think about some other things in the timeline. The Mexican election for president and for both houses of Congress is on July 1st. For a whole range of reasons, even if you finish negotiations at the beginning of May, it can't be signed because of notifications of Congress until August or September or so. A new Mexican Senate comes into office on September 1st, and the character of that Senate could very much change and swing to the left. It's unlikely that the current president of Mexico, who leaves office in December, will submit something to the Mexican Senate before the US midterm elections, because if something were to go wrong, it would be a huge embarrassment. So there's a period of 3 weeks between the US midterm elections and the current president of Mexico leaving, where you could potentially submit to the Mexican Senate a signed agreement for Mexico to ratify that agreement and potentially lock in one piece of it, just one piece of it. That is the best case scenario of what you can get to a renegotiated NAFTA in the short term. And potentially the next case scenario is that everybody agrees that there's so much uncertainty that we're just going to all agree that we're going to live with the current NAFTA agreement until sometime next year after this political season. And then there is the other dangling factor out here is, does the United States simply pull out because of something that becomes convenient or a political issue in the relationship where President Trump decides that he's actually going to go forward and execute the withdrawal clauses from NAFTA, which in and of themselves become complicated. The reason I give you that complexity is not because we all want to thrive on it.
Can I just add a footnote? Carlos has given you the Mexican timetable, but to what he's told you, you've got to add that on July 1st in the US, TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, the so-called Fast Track Authority, expires. So Congress has to renew the president's fast track or trade promotion authority around July. And then second, you've got a tradition, it's not written anywhere, but no president has sent a free trade agreement to a Congress during an election year. Right. And then you've got the US midterms in November, where for different reasons, sitting Dems and Republicans would hate to have to vote on or say anything about trade with the midterms looming in November. So you've got two calendars playing at the same time, creating a very, very, very narrow window for anything of substance to happen in 2018.
Yeah, the likelihood that I would think that any U.S. congressman or senator who's up for re-election would vote for anything that has free trade in the title right now is somewhere between 0 and 0, I would say. And so where does that leave you? It leaves us in a situation where can NAFTA be renegotiated? Yeah, it can. Can there be better terms that modernize the treaty? Yes, there can be. There are a whole series of issues that are conflictual, which I'm sure you'll want to get into. But is it likely that we're going to see a new NAFTA this year? Absolutely, we're not going to see a new NAFTA this year. It's not going to happen. Can we see one in 2019? Potentially we could, but it's going to be an uphill climb. And people should start getting used to the possibility that we end up having to go back to WTO terms if, in fact, the United States decides to pull out of the relationship.
But can I just, one clarification? So you think the reversion point is actually the status quo, most likely, or WTO terms? You wouldn't see like a trade war, like a...
You could.
You could. The most probable scenario is a zombie NAFTA. What do I mean by a zombie NAFTA? That if we can get a deal in the coming weeks on the one issue they're going to try and get a deal, which is rules of origin for the automotive sector, because that's where Trump can claim victory that he has done something about the trade deficit. If they can achieve closure on that issue, that means that the other 29 chapters are still pending. So what may end up happening is that we have text that has been reopened, is being renegotiated, with one chapter where there's an agreement in principle. Remember, free trade agreements, you don't have a deal until you have a deal in every single one of the chapters that you've agreed to negotiate. So while we press pause, we park the agreement, we park the negotiations until Mexico elects a president, you guys go through midterms, and then we figure out whether we can do something in the lame duck. That's what I refer to as zombie NAFTA. NAFTA has not collapsed, but there's no certainty, if you're an investor, if you're a corporation, as to what's going to happen in 2019. The worst case scenario is that President Trump gets fidgety and decides to do what he says every week, which is unilaterally withdraw from that. If that happens, then you could end up with some form of escalation or tit for tat in terms of tariffs, which would be a disaster. Now, if at the end of the day, we can end up with a modernized North American free trade agreement, this would be a win-win-win, even though President Trump does not believe in win-win negotiations. He sees everything as a zero-sum game, which is part of the problem. Mm-hmm. But as Rahm Emanuel used to say, you should never let a good crisis go to waste. And given that Donald Trump created this crisis of renegotiating NAFTA, we could actually end up with a 21st century trading system. Remember, NAFTA was agreed to and signed 20 plus years ago. There wasn't Amazon, there wasn't eBay, there were no digital trade flows, no e-commerce. All of these issues have to be factored into NAFTA. So at the end of the day, we could end up with a 3.0 21st century rules-based trading mechanism, which allows us to remain competitive. And for a president who's obsessed with China, if there's one tool that allows the US and ergo North America to remain competitive vis-a-vis China, it's a modernized and upgraded NAFTA. But we'll see. We'll have to wait and see. I think that if we can get white smoke or semi-white smoke in the coming weeks as to the rules of origin chapter. That will create, I think, some positive forward momentum. We've already closed 7 chapters in total of important but minor stuff. But you will still have, rules of origin was one of the famous poison pills. You still have 3 other poison pills which we have not dealt with. Government procurement, the sunset clause, which Trump wants to tack onto the free trade agreement, which is ridiculous because, again, if you're Ford, you're not gonna invest in anywhere in North America, certainly Canada and Mexico, if every 5 years you're gonna have to renegotiate the free trade agreement. It's good that we review the free trade agreement every 5 years, but if we have to renegotiate it automatically every 5 years, it's gobbledygook. So that's poison pill number 2. Then you've got poison pill, you've got rules of origin, you've got the sunset clause, you've got government procurement, which the US is trying to significantly change. And the problem here is we would probably be less affected, but US access to government procurement in Mexico is huge. And so this could be a really important issue. And then you've got the last poison pill, which are the dispute resolution mechanisms, state-state, state investor, and state-state, which are a really complex problem, which have allowed the private sectors of our 3 countries to challenge decisions that they feel are unfair these past 20 years. And these 3 other issues, we haven't even scratched the surface in moving forward on those. So this is a very challenging moment. I think the 3 governments are gonna try and signal that they've been able to agree in principle to the rules of origin, to send a positive signal to the markets, to be able to create some forward momentum as they push pause. But then what happens between now and the the re-engagement once you have a new Congress and you have a new Mexican administration come December 1st, that's a big question mark.
And well, Secretary Schultz and Pedro Aspe, former finance minister from Mexico, did an excellent op-ed, I think it was New York Times, where they laid out what a modernized treaty would look like, and in particular, protection for intellectual property rights, no subsidies for state entities, and protection of the IT and telecommunications industry, as Arturo was indicating. And they really set out some of the critical provisions that were negotiated as part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which were then abandoned and dropped when the United States fell out of it. So the roadmap of what a better NAFTA would look like has very much been set, including by your own here at the university. One of the factors that in a logical world should be influencing American diplomacy is that the United States nor anybody else doesn't know what's going to happen on July 1st in Mexico and what the results of the elections are. The polls currently indicate that the far left candidate, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is seen as a populist, who is seen as quite to the left, who has been seen as having broad commitment to many general principles, but not an economic program or strategy behind it, currently is leading in the polls by 17 or 18%. Right? And his 2 principal candidates are doing everything possible, our opponents are doing everything possible to tear each other down from the center left and the center right party. And so it's really his race to lose. And if you were in the position of the United States, and if I was the US ambassador in Mexico at this point in time, one of the logical things you would say is that, look, here are the prospects of what this could look like in the future. And if you want to reduce uncertainty and create an environment of greater stability, you try to do everything you can to grab the deal that you can with the players that you know and to close it now. And in the end, send that signal to markets. And that signal has a big impact in markets both in the United States and Mexico. It's not just investment in Mexico. But here in California, in Texas, in Iowa, the impact that this has had, particularly on Midwest and Texan trade in Mexico, is quite significant. And so if you can stabilize those markets and provide some certainty about the future, that would be a very positive thing. That's the logical point of view. And what we don't know is that in the context of the trade wars with China, the issues that continue to arise with steel and their negotiations, how this is going to play out in other negotiations, for example, on North Korea. Does the United States in the end start making concessions to China because we need their support on a North Korea agreement? And in the end, how does this play back to the base if those trends emerge? And how do you tell the base, I looked out for you by protecting your interests? You could see things happen on the US-Mexico relationship that may seem unconnected, but could have an impact and playing back into the politics of the United States. And that's just one of the things that just makes it so hard to judge about exactly where it's going to go.
So you've been answering some of the questions I had about NAFTA as we've been moving along, but I will open in a few minutes more. But I do want to ask about something else beyond trade, because obviously the border, a lot of things move across the border. People move across the border. Guns move across the border, drugs move across the border. So there's two things that I would be curious if you could tell us a little bit more about. One is, the possibility of a better NAFTA or a NAFTA 3.0. Would that involve thinking about professional services, thinking about labor? It used to be a time when the questions were about environment or about, labor codes in Mexico in the old NAFTA. Is it possible to envisage something that would actually create a linkage to a better kind of 21st century in this interconnected world, NAFTA, or is that just a dream of the liberals or the left that is just not in the cards in any way?
Well, there's no doubt that if this is done correctly, we will end up with a much better regulatory edifice for North America. What does that include is still an open question. There won't be labor mobility, but there will be labor issues addressed that weren't addressed in the original NAFTA. Remember, for starters, one of the conditionalities of the Clinton administration to continue pursuing the ratification of the North American Free Trade Agreement that had been negotiated by the Bush 41 administration and the Mexican-Canadian governments of the time was to tack on the side agreements on the environment and on labor. But they were side agreements. One of the things that is happening in this negotiation is that both side agreements will become a full piece and parcel of the treaty itself. One of the issues that is now being put on the table by the US on the issue of rules of origin is to tie North American content of automobile production to labor in Mexico, increasing wages, basically an increase in wage. How that plays out politically weeks before a general presidential election in Mexico is still a big question. But that may play some role in the whole discussion over labor issues in the North American economy. But we're not going to see anything akin to an issue which would make all the sense in the world, which is labor mobility, because of the complementarities of the labor markets of both countries and what's happening to the demographic curves in both nations over the next 20 years. But something as advanced as that is not on the table. And I think we've lost an opportunity because I think given that we were going to renegotiate this, we should have gone as ambitious as we could, because that also creates factors for support on Congress. Let's play a game here. If the US Congress receives a sort of hyped up, modified North American Free Trade Agreement, the incentives to battle this one out and approve it are going to be much lesser than if there's a really ambitious, gold standard free trade agreement where the US will once again lead the global community in building what those 21st century trading mechanisms look like. That's not going to happen.
There's the downsides of anything associated with free trade right now are so high that this administration isn't going to be the champion for those principles of free trade. It's just not going to happen. I think that there are some things that can be done on intellectual property, on modernization of protection of provisions for IT and media, as you've laid out.
Data flows.
Data flows will make a big difference. It'll be very, very difficult to address the labor questions.
Financial services, can you imagine anything going on there?
The point that I was gonna come back to that I think actually can be much more significant than people realize, and maybe even more significant than I gave credit for even 9 months ago, is actually on energy. So obviously one of the things that's happened over this past administration in Mexico is that Mexico's changed its constitution to allow for private investment in every aspect of its energy sector: oil, gas, pipelines, power sector, gasoline stations. The entire sector has been opened up to private investment. In the 1990s, when the United States had proposed incorporating energy into NAFTA, President Salinas of Mexico at that point said, "You do that and I'm no longer the president of Mexico." It's a profound change that's occurred. From that profound change, Mexico has awarded in bid rounds in the oil and gas sector, for example, 107 different contracts that will bring in those together with the power sector somewhere in the range of $175 to $200 billion worth of investment flows over the coming years. It's massive in its scale. One of the things in Mexican law is that it's a treaty, and in Mexico it's not an agreement, it's actually a treaty. A treaty has stature almost equal to the Constitution and above to legislation that is passed by the Congress. And what it begins to do is, if you actually can incorporate the energy amendments in the energy chapter into NAFTA and get it agreed to, it provides added protection.
Bulletproofs.
That you can continue with the energy reforms into the future. And that is quite a very significant factor that maybe was not consciously thought of in those terms when it was started, but right now it looks very significant.
Okay, so some opportunities, a lot of challenges. Let's open up to questions from the audience because I want to make sure. Please start over here with Secretary Schultz.
The question is, how much damage is going to be done and what is its nature before people come to realize certain basic facts? Let me mention two of them. First, if a nation consumes more than it produces, it will import more than it exports. That's not economics, that's arithmetic. So that's the arithmetic of the US trade deficit. It really doesn't have much to do with relations, no things we're negotiating. So in order to do something about our trade deficit, we have to do something about our budget deficit, which is a huge act of dissaving. I wrote that in the Washington Post with a very good economist named Marty Feldstein. And the director of the budget came through here. Since I was the first director of the budget, he came and called on me. And I had just written it. I said, "Did you see that op-ed?" "Yeah," he said, "I saw it." And I put it on the president's desk, but he didn't read it. Somebody's got to read it. So that's a basic fact. And if we want to do something about the trade deficit, we got to do something about overspending. The second basic fact is this. If you buy a house somewhere, you look at the house, right? But that's not all you look at. You look at the neighborhood. You want to know, is it safe? Are the schools good? And so on and so on. The same is true in international relations. President Reagan and I both thought foreign policy starts in your neighborhood. And if you have a good neighborhood, you have something to work from. So we worked hard, and subsequent presidents worked hard to create a North America, a neighborhood. It didn't exist before. Mexico always thought of itself as part of Latin America. And it gradually was thinking itself part of North America. And that was creating a neighborhood. Neighbors can work with each other on all sorts of problems, not just trade. So I think these basic things have to dawn on people again, and then we'll get somewhere. And the question is, how much repair needs to be done? If you've gone on a construction job in California, and you don't, or Texas or Florida, if you don't speak Spanish, you don't know what's going on. So we need people. But actually today, fertility in Mexico is way down, replacement level. There are more, I think in the last year, more Mexicans returned to Mexico than came here. So these are facts that people have to somehow come to grips with. I'd be glad to have your comments.
How do we do this?
Well, I think what you point to, Secretary, is a challenge that we face right now in American politics and global politics, which is how do you make facts count? And increasingly, we have entered into a phase of populism in politics in countries throughout the world. And in the United States, issues of trade have not been based on the reality of trade balances, a recognition of our consumption patterns, the impact of the deficit, but in a sense saying back to a population that feels scared about the future, that if you're scared about the future, I'll protect you. And I think that if there's one thing that President Trump did particularly well in the campaign, was he understood how to touch that chord with American people at a point in time of great insecurity. There's a demographer at the American Enterprise Institute named Nick Eberstadt who has studied these questions. And one of the striking things that Nick has found is that not only is there a question of unemployment, but particularly among the male population in the United States, that for every person who is seeking a job, 3 have actually left the workforce. So this is for males above the age of 18. Right? And so what it tells you is that there's a huge population there that has great uncertainty about the future, and they have become very difficult to be able to reach out to. And I think one of the challenges that we face today in our politics in the United States, it's going to be increasingly an issue in Mexico, depending on what the outcome is of the elections in July. It's an issue in Russia, where Vladimir Putin has been the king of pop and has been a leader of many of these populist movements throughout the world. We've seen it in different parts of Europe.
Hungary is
a very good case. The Philippines is another case, is that instead of actually dealing with the questions that are behind the problems, it's much easier in a populist world to deal with the symptoms. And I think one of the huge contributions that an institution like Stanford can make is, how do you develop the kinds of strategies that make a difference? And so I'm going to leave you with a question, Alberto. So, I mean, what can you do in the Center for Latin American Studies to bring in your knowledge and people like Frank Fukuyama and Steve Krasner and Larry Diamond, who have been dealing with these questions for a long time? And how do countries develop the strategies to actually turn democracy into a check on populism rather than actually making it a funnel for more populistic rhetoric on the other side? Answer yet?
Not yet. Arturo's turn.
Let me react to the Secretary's comments. You're absolutely right. The problem is that everything that you said doesn't fit in a bumper sticker. No to NAFTA fits beautifully in a bumper sticker. And the problem is, how do we translate this data into narrative and storytelling? How do we create a connection between citizens and the public policy that is impacting them? That is at the core of what happened in the United States in 2016, but also what happened in the UK over Brexit, and what we're seeing in other parts of the world. You're absolutely right. You know, the president is obsessed with the trade deficit with Mexico. It so happens that the trade deficit with Mexico represents 8% of the total US trade deficit worldwide. 8%. The president, in the early days of his administration, was banging the desk saying, I'm going to impose tariffs on Mexico as a way to have Mexico pay for the wall. Well, Carlos just told you, out of every dollar of Mexican exports to the United States, 40 cents are US products. So when the president started saying this, I said, be my guest, you're going to slap 20% tariffs on 40 cents of US products. The problem is, how do we translate all of this into a narrative that reconnects people with the public policy debate and discussion? And that's going to be very challenging because governments have failed, the private sectors in the United States, Mexico, and Canada have failed. Institutions need to, like this one, need to start playing a much more, I think, frontal role in devising ways of reconnecting these relevant public policy issues to citizens who increasingly believe the political parties, left and right, do not represent them, are leaving them behind. And that is a huge challenge to liberal democracy worldwide. And it's happened here, it's happening in Europe, and it could certainly happen in a country like Mexico.
Let me pick two questions from the audience because we're kind of getting towards the time frame. So there's one on this side, there's another one on the back, and then I'll get to you as well. So we'll take those three in a row because otherwise we're on top of our time. Yes.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. To Ambassador Pascual, you mentioned that López Obrador has an advantage of 18 points in the polls. 1 month ago, he said that he would appoint Jesus Seadelu as his chief negotiator of NAFTA if he wins. He also has Gerardo Esquivel, Graciela Marquez, who are Harvard economists and Oxford economists with Jesus Seade. Do you think that gave a message of comfort to the American administration and the American private sector in the sense that if he wins, he would maintain at least a reasonable and rational course of negotiations with NAFTA?
Let me take two more because otherwise, so in the back, Steve.
So this was a question I actually asked Carlos this morning. So, I mean, if Mexico wanted to damage Trump's base of support in the United States, what actions might be available?
And let's take this one as well, please. I'm sorry, I'm dumping all these questions.
My question's really going back to something that Secretary Schultz alluded to, which is the issue of border crossings from Mexico into the United States, which has been effectively net zero in recent years. And where it seems to have come from, to the extent there has been immigration, illegal immigration, a lot of it has been focused on folks coming out of the Northern Triangle. Mm-hmm. And that saw a manifestation of that in the last couple of weeks with the, quote, caravan and what's happening here. And my question is really to our Mexican guest. What is Mexico trying to do today to address that? Because I think that's our concern is that Mexico's becoming a transit country, and that it really has little to do with U.S.-Mexico immigration and immigration.
So let's try to address some of the questions.
So why don't I start with López Obrador and then point out the irony here that, here you have a former American ambassador to Mexico now living in Mexico and a foreign Mexican ambassador to the United States living in the United States. So we'll comment on each other's politics. But it's an interesting question that you raise, and one that many people in Mexico are struggling with, of how to understand López Obrador and what he says and what his team says. There are many people around the candidate, López Obrador, who have tried to create an image of a reasonable, thoughtful person. And so, for example, on the energy reforms, the leader of his economic and commercial team said, we've reviewed all of the contracts that were issued in the bid rounds, because all the contracts are public now. They're posted on the internet. There are major steps in transparency that have been taken. And we've reviewed them, and they're okay, and they can go forward. And on national television 2 weeks later, López Obrador says, we're going to review all the contracts. Until I've reviewed all the contracts, we're not going to give any certainty on whether they can continue. There are people on his team who have said there's a big debate in Mexico about building a new airport and significant investments and contracts that have been signed. And of course, we're going to go and continue with the airport, but we want to make sure that everything is done in the most efficient way possible. López Obrador afterwards came out and on public television said, we're not going to build that airport. Right? And so part of the challenge that is happening right now is that there's a disconnect between the candidate and the team. And as a result of that, if you're going to bet on which one do you want to believe the team or do you want to believe the candidate? And I think you got to go with the candidate right now. And so it's created another environment of, it's added to the environment of uncertainty. So it'd be great to think that there would be a prospect for more of a movement to the center. But I think the candidate himself has actually indicated that that's not quite where he is right now.
Can I add a quick footnote to that question? I think that both Gerardo Esquivel, who said that they would seek to keep the current negotiating team, NAFTA negotiating team in place, and both Dr. Seade are very competent economists. The problem is that then, again, to Carlos's point, López Obrador last week says, he said, we want negotiations, the renegotiation of NAFTA to stop until there's a new president, which if I was advising either Ricardo Anaya or López Obrador, I'd be telling them to say exactly the same thing. Then he said, and when I do start renegotiating, I'm gonna add the issue of migration to NAFTA. And then that's where I get scared, because that means that either he knows nothing about what's going on in the negotiation, or he has no one in his team telling him simply what's going on in the United States today over immigration policy. And so it's those issues that in sort of on my radar screen flash up red and which create some concern.
Can someone address Steve's point?
Steve Krasner from back, one of the political scientists I cited that he was going to solve the populism problem with you in future research. One of the interesting things of what's happened in the United States is that the biggest pushback against the threat to blow NAFTA up and to support NAFTA has actually been coming from decentralized bases of support around the country. Texas is the biggest exporter per capita of any state to Mexico. They have huge interest in maintaining that relationship on everything from energy and oil and gas. Do you know the United States exports more gas, natural gas, and more gasoline to Mexico than to any other country in the world? And the United States, if Mexico did not take the amount of natural gas that it currently takes from the United States, it would collapse natural gas prices domestically in the U.S. and have a direct impact in the production of shale gas here in the U.S. Now, I imagine there are probably certain people on this campus that would think that that would be a good thing to collapse shale gas production in the U.S., but that's another argument to have a different day. Other states that are critical, Iowa, Illinois, agricultural products. Michigan, the integration of the automotive sector has become critically interested in the connections of production lines. And so I think one of the things that's going to have to happen if NAFTA is going to survive and we're going to come out with a better outcome is that those states and those workers who are directly affected and those exporters are going to have to make their voices more effectively known. I know one of the things, and maybe Arturo can pass it over to you, talk a little bit about the kind of work that the Mexican Embassy has done in the past to work together at a state level, because you guys have become expert at it.
No, Carlos is referencing one of the pressure points, which is red ag Republican states that gave Trump his victory in the Electoral College. And if there's one reason why, after the fiscal reform was approved in Congress in December, President Trump, has sort of pulled back a bit on the threat of unilateral withdrawal of NAFTA, it's because the ag Republican Trump states have pressed back and said, you can't do this. Why? Because they remember what I did as an ambassador, Carlos was there, in 2009 when Congress decided to defund a pilot program to allow Mexican trucks to cross into the US. The US had been in violation of NAFTA since 1993 by buckling to the pressure of the Teamsters and not allowing Mexican trucks to cross into the United States. We took it to the WTO, we won, we held our guns, and finally when Congress defunded the demonstration program, we slapped $2.3 billion of countervailing duties on a carousel of US products from the states where the members of Congress supporting the Teamsters hailed from. In 7 months, those same members of Congress that had been supporting the Teamsters went to the White House and said, please solve this with Mexico because we're getting clobbered. That is the blueprint of what Mexico could do to retaliate against ag states that have Mexico as their #1 export market. Very few people in the United States understand that today Mexico buys more US exports, and take your pick, I'll give you several regional examples. Mexico buys more US exports than all of Latin America and the Caribbean combined, or we buy more US exports than the 4 so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China. We buy more US exports than Canada and Japan put together. And if we assume that Brexit is a fait accompli, we buy more US products than all of the European Union put together. So that's a very compelling tool. There are 2 others which I would put on the table. One has to do with guns, the other one has to do with drugs. As you know well, drugs move in one direction, but guns move in the other. And again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out why there are more gun shops and gun shows on the 4 border states with Mexico than Walmarts. They're feeding the supply for fully automatic or semi-automatic high caliber weapons to the Mexican drug syndicates. What do? Mexico and the United States have developed a very successful program called E-Trace that allows, when you've seized a weapon in Mexico, to trace back through the database with ATF who sold that gun and where that gun was sold in the United States. What I would do is I would litigate for every Mexican Marine, every Mexican soldier, every Mexican federal policeman who's being killed by one of those weapons. I would take each one of those gun shops to court in the US on behalf of those families. And then the third one, drugs. Given that 9 states in the United States today have legalized recreational use of marijuana, I would simply declare that as of today, Mexico will not expend a single dollar and 1 hour of manpower on eradicating and interdicting cannabis on its way to the United States. We're going to use that manpower and those resources to fight against other more pernicious drugs like cocaine or fentanyl. But we're going to stop spending our resources, our Churchillian quota of sweat, tears, blood, and blood, toil, sweat, tears, and blood, on fighting cannabis when it's legal in the United States. These are some of the things that Mexico could do. There are others that are much more complex that involve the question that you've asked, which is what Mexico does in preventing transmigration of Central Americans through Mexico, which Mexico has been doing a lot. It is very unpopular in Mexico. It is diplomatically explosive with our Central American neighbors because we are perceived to be doing the US's dirty job on our border with Guatemala. It is increasingly under focus as a way to sort of level the playing field. And it would have a very profound impact on transmigration flows on the US border, precisely because Mexican migration to the United States is zero or even now negative in terms of the flows that have been occurring. So these are some of the tools that Mexico has. Some of them are very complex because in a post 9/11 world, your security is our security. We have spent 2 decades underscoring that if you succeed, we succeed, and if we fail, you fail, and that it is much better to be partners to success and accomplices to failure. But at the end of the day, the Mexican government, I think that's part of what's going. It may be a bit of a kabuki going on here, but the decision announced by the foreign minister of the Mexican government is now openly reviewing every single mechanism of bilateral collaboration with the United States, may be pointing in this direction.
Okay, I have to cut the conversation at this stage. I see Grant coming up here. I do want to ask one last thing, just because this is in the spirit of what could we do to change the discourse? So I want each of the ambassadors to tell me in 3 words something you love about Mexico and something you love about the United States.
Mine's easy, my wife. 2 words.
That's a very tough question. I've lived a total of 20 years in the US in different...
You're in 23 words now.
very different incarnations. I met my wife in Washington. I got my allergies pollen in Washington. My girls were born in the US. No, but I think that it's the endless possibilities that the United States has as a society. And something that we've tried, and one of the reasons why we decided to stay in the United States with 2 young daughters, which is how this society has always given back to those that have less. That sense of social co-responsibility with society is something that I have always found so compelling and so extraordinary in the US.
So let me just say, you can try to turn the hard questions back to Stanford. We'll always have more questions for you. Please join me again in thanking all 3 of our guests.